Hi, I'm Lori Marks. In part two of this workshop, I'll provide a review of the essays in the reading set with advice about how to employ those essays. If you're looking for advice on writing a passing essay, please watch part one of the workshop. I'm just going to start with some general information about what's coming up. We're holding writing labs on December 22nd and 23rd. Our program will be closed December 24th to January 3rd because the entire university is closing. Then we're holding draft reviews January 3rd and 4th. For the draft reviews, you just have to schedule an appointment, but it doesn't matter what time the appointment is. What you're doing is you're scheduling a half hour of staff time, and all you need to do is to send us your draft before that appointment time. We'll review your draft during that half hour and send you feedback by email. Here are a couple of errors that we noticed in the reading set, which shows that no matter how much you proofread, it's still possible to make mistakes. First, the bibliographic information on the Tinker essay is incomplete. His essay is the introduction to a book by Ward Churchill. This is why he keeps referencing Churchill's book in his essay. Second, there's an error on page 9 where we listed a date as 2023 when it should be 2003. In this talk, I'm going to primarily focus on how these readings are relevant to your project rather than try to tell you what each essay in the reading set is saying. I'll follow this review with a more detailed discussion of the Tinker essay, which we consider to be the most difficult piece in this collection. I suggest that you follow along in your copy of the reading set and take notes in the text. When you work with sources, you need to understand what the material is that you're working with and what audience it is intended for. The first reading is a flyer published by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. It's available on the internet and seems to be intended to explain their position on truth commissions to anyone who's interested. Therefore, it's a position paper that also has a public relations role. This organization is a nonprofit agency that was formed in 2011 for the purpose of providing information about the history of Native American boarding schools and promoting healing among the people who are suffering as a result of this history. The second essay is by Andrea Smith, who's a professor at the University of California, Riverside. At the time she wrote this essay, she was associated with Amnesty International, and the essay was published in Amnesty Now, which was a publication of Amnesty International. Amnesty International is an organization that originally was created to seek the release of political prisoners and that now works to uphold the whole spectrum of human rights. The third selection, by Mary Crow Dog, is from her memoir titled Lakota Woman. Originally published in 1990, Lakota Woman was a national bestseller and winner of the American Book Award. It's described as a story of determination against all odds, of the cruelties perpetuated against American Indians, and of the Native American struggle for rights. Finally, the essay by George Tinker is the introduction to a book by Ward Churchill. George Tinker is a professor in the Iliff School of Theology who teaches courses in American Indian cultures, history, and religious traditions. He also teaches cross-cultural and third world theologies and is involved in justice and peace studies. In his essay, Tinker is reviewing and expressing his general agreement with the author of the book, who is Ward Churchill, and he's lending his support to the legitimacy of Churchill's book. The publisher is a small press that was started by beatnik poets in the 1950s. And in the beginning, that press was just publishing their poetry. But now it's known and respected for its commitment to innovative and progressive ideas and its resistance to forces of conservatism and censorship. What you're looking at now is the prompt for the challenge essay. 3 of these pieces in the reading set directly address the question in the prompt. Those that do discuss a truth commission are the first piece, the one by Smith, and the one by Tinker, and they disagree with each other. It's up to you to engage with and confirm or cast doubt upon the positions taken by your sources. So, when working with materials that aren't directly relevant to the topic, you have to use them to construct your argument and you have to explain how you are using them. This kind of writing is called analysis. Also, we're asking you to imagine a response to these readings and play a role in an imagined debate. To do this, you need to engage in some creative thinking. So these are the 2 kinds of thinking we're looking for you to practice in your essay. One is analysis and one is creative thinking. In this essay, we're asking you to write on a historical topic, but to compose an argument regarding how we should respond to these historical events. It's easy to tell a story, so you may be tempted to devote a lot of your paper to recounting the history of what happened. However, you should not write a history report. You need to answer the question we're asking you to write about, and you can't do that by reciting the events. You can safely assume that your audience is familiar with the facts because the WPE graders all have to read the reading set. Therefore, provide information to keep your reader oriented to your argument and remind them of what's under discussion. The main role of the readings is to give you evidence in your argument, but if you devote more than a few sentences to reporting information, your essay is probably in trouble. In addition, you'll notice that your sources in this reading set contradict each other regarding the historical information. They disagree on dates, the total number of boarding schools, the number of children who attended, and how long this program operated. You could acknowledge the disagreement between your sources, and if you want to, you could use these contradictions as support for the argument that we need a Truth and Justice Commission, so we can determine what the facts are. But your essay should not try to determine what the facts are. That's not your job, and we haven't given you the resources to do it. So I'm asking you to not get distracted from your purpose. We're not asking you to write a history report, and we're not asking you to write an investigation into what really happened. Here's a rather amazing photograph from around 1900, which shows on the left side 3 Lakota Native American boys as they first arrived at the boarding school, which was called the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And then on the right side, we see them transformed. They're all wearing uniforms. The hair has been cut, and they look like their culture has been erased. I'm going to review each of the essays in turn. The author of this flyer is listed as anonymous because we don't know who wrote it. However, since this piece appears on the website of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, you can treat the organization as the author. This piece provides a brief version of their position that a truth commission would be valuable to determine what the facts about what happened actually are. From reading it, you can gather that they think it's important to locate and secure the surviving records about the boarding schools program. To do this, the federal government would have to be involved since those were records of a federal program. Also, these people think that interviews and testimony are essential before the witnesses die of old age. One thing they don't say is how they think the information gathered by the Truth Commission would be used, or how it could make a difference to the individual and community victims of the program. These 2 pages are relevant to your project in helping you to identify what we know and what we don't know. And therefore, this is information that might be discovered by the Truth Commission. Also, it could help you to discuss what do many Native American people consider to be important about this history. And finally, what information may be important to healing. Andrea Smith's essay seems primarily focused on winning support for the Truth Commission idea and for the Boarding School Healing Project, which appears to have been a precursor to the National Boarding School Healing Coalition. Much of her essay is devoted to presenting a history of the boarding schools, which suggests that her audience is composed of people who aren't familiar with this history. So it seems likely that this essay is her presentation of the project to the Amnesty International members, which is part of the work she did as a Ralph Bunche Fellow. This essay is more informational than analytical, and so its purpose or focus appears close to the end when she has delivered her information and transitioned to a discussion of what we should do about it. Some essays want to convince you of something, but her essay wants to convince its readers to do something to support the boarding school healing project. I think this statement on page 9 seems like a good statement of purpose. She writes, success of the boarding school healing project could be critical to the healing of indigenous peoples from both contemporary and historical human rights abuses. Native communities, the project's founders hope, will begin to view the abuse as the consequence of human rights violations perpetrated by church and state, rather than as an issue of community dysfunction and individual failings. What she's implying here is that the problems that plague Native American communities are falsely understood to be the fault of the communities or the fault of individuals. And she says that this is a case of misplaced blame. She's arguing that instead the blame should be put on the institutions such as churches and the federal government, which operated the boarding schools and established and perpetuated the program of forcing children to attend those schools. This is an important idea because it's opening the door to a logical argument that it's necessary to place the blame where it belongs before recovery can begin. This idea is similar to thinking about psychological recovery from sexual or child abuse. Before a victim can recover, they need to stop blaming themselves for what happened and learn to blame the perpetrator. So the relevance of Smith's essay to your project, her essay can help you to discuss the possible purpose of a truth commission, why a truth commission may be necessary, and why the federal government is culpable for what happened with the Native American boarding schools. Mary Crow Dog's memoir was a bestseller, so even if she wrote it mainly to be read by her fellow Indians, it was read by a lot of other people as well. It won the American Book Award and inspired a 1994 film. A few years after she left school, Mary Crow Dog joined the American Indian Movement, which, like many social change organizations, began in the late 1960s. AIM, the American Indian Movement, helped to change perceptions of Native Americans, to establish reservations, and to improve access to government funding for community building and education. Mary Crow Dog participated in the Trail of Broken Treaties in 1970 and the Wounded Knee occupation in 1973. And in fact, during that occupation, she gave birth to her first child. Later, she married the spiritual leader for the American Indian Movement, a man named Leonard Crow Dog, and she published a second memoir in 1993, and she died in 2013. This selection from her memoir doesn't have a purpose. I mean, it's a memoir. She's just telling the story of what happened. But it is relevant to your project. It gives you a pretty specific example of what it was like to be a student in one of these boarding schools. It allows you to think about how students might have resisted the way they were treated, and to think about what people were thinking who ran these schools. And finally, to at least mull over this question, which really bothers me, why did parents send their children to these schools when they did have a choice? And let me just add that when this program was first instituted, parents were forced to allow their children to go to these schools. But later on, like by the time Mary Crow Dog was a student in one of these schools, it was actually a choice, and children did not have to go. The fourth piece in the reading set is by George Tinker. His essay also isn't a traditional analytical essay because it was written as an introduction to a book authored by Ward Churchill. The basic thesis of Churchill's book is implied by its title, that the Indian residential schools were genocidal in their impact. Tinker does seem to agree with Churchill's thesis, and he devotes his essay to identifying and responding to the highlights of Churchill's argument. So it's a bit of a surprise when you reach the end of Tinker's essay and discover that Tinker's opposed to a truth commission. But I think that Tinker's argument saves us from just blandly agreeing that a truth commission is a good thing, and his position suggests other ways for us to think about this topic. So I believe that his thesis is on page 18 to 19, when he writes, as a result of Churchill's use of the word genocide, like no other analyst to date, he has been able to segregate shadow from substance with regard to the form, function, and impacts of the systems of residential schooling imposed upon American Indians by both the U.S. and Canada. This essay is relevant to your project because it can help you to figure out what was the intention of the boarding school program, to consider whether it's reasonable to call the program genocidal, and to consider this syndrome called residential school syndrome, which Tinker says continues to have an impact upon Native American people and communities. And here we have an image of George Tinker himself when he was giving a presentation at a conference. And he seems like he would have been a really formidable speaker. So now I'm going to get into a further discussion of Tinker's essay. I'm not going to tell you what to think about his ideas or what you should do about them. What I will do is try to go methodically through his essay, pick out the most significant components, and suggest avenues you could choose to explore. On page 14, Tinker's essay begins with a question. Who can quarrel with education? In his essay, he expresses an answer to that question. Native American people certainly can quarrel with the manner and purpose that education was imposed upon them. However, Tinker makes an interesting move early in his essay. He says that the residential schools were well-intentioned because the people he describes as liberal colonizers were trying to advance the state of Indian people in North America. That's on page 14. He calls this good intention a rationalization of conquest. Although his language is pretty neutral, when I read this sentence, it feels sarcastic. Tinker understands what happened in the past and why it happened, but he seems to be saying that this rationalization is unacceptable. So, why are residential schools a reason to argue with education? Tinker points out that the program did not function as a good in Native communities. Normally, we think of education as a path for young people to increase their knowledge and understanding, become better equipped to serve as citizens in a democracy, and be empowered to get jobs that take advantage of their gifts and talents. However, on page 15, Tinker explains that the schools for the colonized were established as a tool of empire. Colonized people are those whose lands and cultures have been overcome by a different people. A good definition of empire that I found on the internet is, at its most basic, an empire is a complex political organization where a dominant central state controls weaker peripheral or outer states. There is no single recipe for making an empire, but the main ingredient is always control. So what Tinker is saying is that the Native American people were colonized and that education became a tool for controlling them. The colonizers, or the Euro-Americans, wanted to practice indirect rule. Therefore, the goal of the program was to assimilate indigenous people to the dominant culture and to inculcate subservience in them. Tinker goes into some detail regarding how the residential schools were used to pursue this assimilationist agenda. The purpose of the schools was to prepare the students for life as a low-paid laborer, at which level they could participate in America's emerging capital-driven wage labor economy. In fact, the students were laborers. They made and washed their own clothing, they did their own cooking, and they were contracted out to labor in the community, with their wages going to support the school. At this point, Tinker pauses to explain that this system was a product of the 19th century liberal inclinations. At least some of the European Americans were concerned about the Native American people who were known to be on the verge of extinction. They wrongly thought that the schools would be helpful. Their good intentions, however, don't excuse the fact that the residential schools were devastating and destructive, and they frequently ended in the death of children. Tinker is making an ethical argument here, one that is relevant to your question having to do with the value of a truth commission. One purpose of a truth commission would be to determine who did wrong and how that wrong was done. Tinker's stressing the point that the people who did wrong are not excused by the fact that they had good intentions. His skepticism about the good intentions of liberal politicians reemerges towards the end of his essay when he expresses his doubt about the value of a truth commission. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. On page 17, Tinker first lists the rationales for federal Indian policies and then goes into a detailed explanation of how these policies were serving as a goal of empire. He wrote, rationales guiding the formulation of federal Indian policies. 1. The need for inculcation of individualism. 2. That to achieve this end, Indians should be universally educated to hold Euro-Western beliefs. And 3. That all Indians should be absorbed as citizens. It's not immediately obvious how individualism or citizenship are part of an assimilationist project, so I encourage you to closely read what Tinker says about these three rationales. He discusses each of them in some detail. On the bottom of page 17, Tinker then gets into some of the details of how the Indian residential education policy was carried out. Here you can see his anger and horror at what happened to these kids and their families. And for someone like me who's more removed from the legacy of this policy, it becomes more clear exactly why this exercise of power caused such a soul wound among the Native American people. I think it's on page 18 that Tinker really starts swinging his fists. Young people who are subjected to the kind of horror that Tinker describes don't have the capacity to free themselves from it or to cope with the damage of the trauma that they have experienced. Therefore, he says, they were left with psycho-emotional devastation. That devastation was cross-generational. It affected the parents of the kids, it affected the kids themselves, and it affected the communities from which the kids were taken. If those children survived, many of them went on to become violent, to abuse alcohol, and to commit suicide, all of which in turn visited more trauma upon the next generation and upon the community. These are things you need to understand in order to write effectively about the value of a truth commission. The boarding school policy was first implemented in 1879 at around the same time that my great-great-grandparents immigrated to this country. They were poor Prussian immigrants who didn't speak the language of their new country. They could easily have been victimized and traumatized. And I see how that damage could pass from one generation to the next and eventually be inflicted on me. Tinker says that for the Native American people who were traumatized by the boarding school program, that damage continues to this day. It's not just something that happened in the distant past. It's on page 18 that he mentions residential school syndrome, which he describes as a complex and intractable blend of devastated self-concept and self-esteem, psychic numbing, chronic anxiety, insecurity, and depression. On pages 19 and 20, Tinker focuses on the question regarding the value of a truth commission. He begins by noting that there is some value in a formal process of identifying the wrongdoing and naming the perpetrators. But he raises some important objections. Essentially, his argument has two parts. On the one hand, a truth commission supported by the very government that promoted this devastating policy would not be trustworthy, and it wouldn't change anything. And on the other hand, it would accomplish what he describes as a consummation of the ill effects of the schools. The ultimate result of a truth commission would be forgiveness, which would let the Euro-Americans off the hook and cause the Native Americans to essentially be self-colonizing. Tinker's argument can be a bit hard to follow, and I don't blame you if you get lost in the text. But I think you can see that he's very skeptical of the idea of a truth commission. He hasn't suggested what we should do instead, but I'm hoping that at least some of you will be able to think of solutions that have a positive effect on Native American people and communities without forcing them to participate in their own assimilation. Finally, we've reached the end of my presentation. I hope that this review has helped you to see how your voice can be important in this topic, and I definitely look forward to seeing some of your essays. Once again, here's our contact information. The best way to reach us is by email, but you can also call us. Please remember that my office will be closed from December 24th to January 3rd.